We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well, welcome everyone. This is the Right Stuff Matters podcast, and I'm your host, Michael Miller. It's been a little while since we've done a podcast episode, and part of that's just because we've been really busy, as many of you can understand and relate to. But there's a lot going on in the world, and particularly right now in our country, and we wanted to make sure that we set aside time to specifically do the podcast that we had envisioned. And now I think that probably more so than ever, we need to have more voices standing up and talking about some of the issues that are really pressing a lot of us, topics that, quite frankly, we're thinking about that are on our mind constantly. And discussions that we're having and discussions that we need to have. And so we're going to be hopefully very diligent in keeping up with more podcast episodes and hopefully getting on here every week, hopefully a couple of times a week. I want to start off by maybe talking a little bit about what we're trying to do with this podcast, because there's a lot of different podcasts out there, all covering different things and sometimes the same things. And we may cover the same things that you might be hearing from other people and other podcasts and programs. You know, what we believe and what we think about the world really does matter. And what we think about the world influences our actions. And so we want to be another voice of reason and truth in what seems to be these days a sea of illogical and ideological half-truths that are swirling around today. And so you're probably going to hear things on this program, like I said, that you've heard other places. And sometimes that might be because some of those people you're listening to are helping us to think through some of those issues. And we will happily source all that different content, and if we got something from a particular person, another program, then we will cite those and give credit to those individuals. And some of it might be because there's a lot of us out there still who know how to use logic and reason, and still a lot of us who still believe in liberty and freedom are good and upright and moral principles that are worth standing up to defend. And that the greatest achievement of human flourishing has occurred right here in the United States of America. And so I'm hoping that by having yet another voice out there, that maybe, just maybe, that more of us will start to stand up as educated and informed citizens, not just citizens of this world, but also citizens of heaven as well. And hopefully we'll start to, if enough of us are talking, that we'll realize that being a Christian is more than just going to conferences and typing away with your thumbs on Twitter. That it's also about influencing the world that we live in for good and not for evil, and which sometimes means standing up against evil and those who represent it. So we're going to work hard to think through some of these difficult issues together, and hopefully we'll have some guests along the way if I don't scare off all of them, and maybe we'll have a little bit of fun along the way as well. So that's what we're trying to do here on the Right Stuff Matters podcast. Think through issues, think through them logically with reason, and to think through them according to the way that Christians should be approaching sometimes the very difficult and challenging issues. And speaking of difficult issues, one of the things we want to talk about today is this idea of mandates. We are starting to see a lot of mandates that are coming out, particularly now around getting a vaccine. And obviously that concerns a lot of people, and others don't seem to be concerned about it at all. And I think that this is an area where we really need to think clearly and think carefully about. There are a lot of practical reasons, but there's also other reasons why mandates, and particularly things that have to do with our health care, are concerning, and we should be concerned about those things. Let's just think about some of the practical things, because I think that that's needed, especially for those of us, if you are in a place in which you have influence for organizations that are trying to think through and decide what they should do about these mandates. If you didn't watch it live, you at least have heard about now that the current administration of the White House came out, our president, Joe Biden, came out just last week and said that he was going to require mandates for the federal employees and for federal contractors, so anybody that does business with the federal government and has contracts, and that he would go as far as to direct OSHA to mandate that vaccines be required for all companies that employ 100 people or more. And so if you didn't watch that live, you at least heard about it very soon after, most likely. And so that affects millions of people in America. A vast majority of people who are employed in this country are impacted by that attempt to mandate health care, which means that a lot of people are in positions, and Christians as well, are in positions to help influence and help make a decision within their companies about what they should think about mandates and whether or not they will go along with this request. And maybe request is a little too light. We could say requirement to direct all of these companies to go down this route of requiring their employees to have a vaccine. And so if you are a business owner or you are in authority over other people, if you manage other people, if you have influence within your companies and what their policies are, then you should be thinking about this. And we should be thinking about, as Christians, are we okay with going along with somebody requiring us to get a vaccine? There's a lot of implications to this. And we're in a position to be able to influence and to stand against things that shouldn't be mandated. And so I would encourage you, if you are in a company and have some degree of influence, that we need to be the voice of reason, which may actually be difficult. But I think that people can be reasoned with. And you might find that you're the only one that has that perspective, but you might also just find out that there's a group of people who actually believe the same thing you do and will also stand and will also start to say something. They just needed somebody else to make the first move and to say it and open it up. But I think generally people are able to be reasoned with. You can have a logical discussion with somebody as to why something like a vaccine mandate, which is a very tense, divisive topic right now, you can reason with people and you can use logic as to why it might not be a very good idea to do that for a whole variety of different reasons. Let's just consider for a minute the practical. If you are a business and you are being told that you have to mandate and you accept this mandate, then I want you to think through the burden that you would have to go through just in order to monitor that and to track that. If you're a business owner, or even if you're not, if you're a senior employee in a company, and now you're going to have to all of your employees to monitor all of their vaccine status, you are going to create a administrative nightmare for yourself within your company, because this isn't just a one and done. We're not just talking about just getting one vaccine and you're finished. There's discussions about boosters and the first booster and a second booster. And before you know it, now you're having to track constantly who has gotten it, who hasn't, and who has exemptions, who doesn't have exemptions. So that's required a lot of people, a lot of money. You're going to have to maintain a HIPAA certified database, worry about data spills. So there's a lot of practical implications for a company. And oh, by the way, think about also potential legal actions that could be brought against you. When you start to get to the point where you actually say that a vaccine is mandated, that something is required, like that has to do with your health care, and you're telling employees that that's required in order to have a job. And let's just say that they go ahead and do it on the basis of that. Are you ready for, if they have medical complications as a result of that, to take on all of the liability as a company for making that a mandatory thing? So there's legal implications. And so both from a practical and from a legal perspective, that has costs. That has real cost. And even if some of those aren't real cost yet, like the potential for legal action, there's still going to be a need to account for that potentially coming. And do you think for a moment that a company is not going to pass that on to you as the consumer? Which means increases in your goods, increases in your services. All of those things will be passed on to you. All of those costs will be passed on to you as the consumer, because they are certainly not going to take the burden of all of that. They will put that cost. So there's obviously economic repercussions as a result of that. And that's where we can use logic and reason and take those kinds of points to a company, to people within the company, and reason with them, even just as a starting point. And we haven't even talked about the implications to freedoms and to liberties that people should have. But even just from a practical perspective, that all should be considered. And again, you may be the one that needs to start that conversation Um, and I guarantee you that you are probably not the only one in your company who is thinking that mandates are not a good idea and that it's not something that they will be willing to go along with. And you may find people standing up with you on that. So that's just the very practical items as a business that are worth considering and using as a starting point for reasoning with people. There are companies that are just going to go along with it. But I think the vast majority of companies are going to take a more, they're going to think about this a little bit before they actually make a decision. And they're not just going to come out and automatically say that they are going to go along with it. And so starting to have that conversation is something that I think we as Christians need to do, especially if you have influence within your company. So, a lot more to be said about that, a lot more to be said about this in general, but we're going to take a quick break and we will be back with more. want to remind you that we will be in Atlanta in just a week and a half. We will be at the G3 Conf September 30th through October 1st. It's going to be a great 2 days. A lot of great speakers lined up. John MacArthur, Vodi Bakum, Paul Washer, a whole bunch of other people are going to be there, and it's going to be a great time. We will have a booth there, so make sure you pay the booth and you check us out. We will also be doing several live podcasts there, and we'll be recording them on in different programs after the conference. But we will also be doing a live podcast as well, several, which will include several interviews with different people like Ray Rhodes and several other people that we've lined up. And so when the G3 conference comes out with their schedule, we will publish a schedule as well, and that way you know when to tune in live to that. So looking forward to that event, looking forward to hopefully seeing some of you who listen to the podcast and who follow along in our ministry. All right, so we've been talking about vaccine mandates. One of the things that actually caught my attention the other day, yesterday I guess it was, is that we've got this article here that came out about the Navy SEALs, that the Navy SEALs, 1/4 to 1/3 of Navy SEALs have said that they will not get the vaccine. Now, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of our military who are the elite of the elite in our military service. The article says several hundred elite Navy SEALs are in danger of being blocked from deploying with their special operator teams by the Pentagon after failing to get a mandatory COVID vaccine, according to a lawyer and a pastor counseling them. It says as many as 1/4 or more of all active duty SEALs, that this would impact their military readiness. Yeah, no kidding. R. Davis Yuntz, Lieutenant Colonel in the Air Force Reserves and a JAG lawyer who is representing several of the special operators as their private lawyer, he said that the Pentagon has put its threat in writing that unvaccinated SEALs, including those who get a religious exemptions or already have natural immunity, will be forbidden from deploying with their teams. He says that it also says that SEALs are not anti-vaccine. In fact, they get all sorts of shots. He said that they just believe more safety data needs to be available to make their own judgment. Yeah. I mean, that's what most people are saying who are concerned about the vaccine. There are a lot of people out there who are not anti-vaccine, who believe that it's okay to get vaccines, right? So the fact that they are looking for additional data before making a decision to take a vaccine that, oh, by the way, is essentially still in trials, is a logical request. And these guys, unlike maybe some that are out there that are talking about this and maybe rejecting the vaccine, these guys are not looking to make book deals. They aren't politicians. They're not trying to be in the public limelight. They are people who went into the military specifically to do a job that the Navy SEALs do as our elite of the elite. There are special forces, and then there's these guys. And they went into the military because they believed in the mission that they were going to be doing. And so now these guys are being told that you will not be able to do that job if you don't get a vaccine that has very little data to support whether or not it's effective or whether there's any dangerous side effects. And interestingly, that it actually points out the fact that even those who get a religious exemption, they will still be forbidden, which means that they will be put on a non-deployed status, which is essentially a career killer within the military. And this idea of religious exemption has been going around. In fact, even here in Loudoun County, there's actually a form you can fill out and you get a religious exemption for your child because schools are mandating it. And they're mandating it for sports to start with, but that won't last long, that it'll just be for that. It'll be for other things as well. And so there is a lot of religious exemption forms flying around out there, and churches who are willing to do that, pastors who are willing to fill out a religious exemption, and I think that we should be willing to do that. But not everybody believes that. There was an article in the New York Times, an opinion piece that was written by a Christian, supposedly, that employers should eliminate any religious exemptions for coronavirus vaccines for Christians, period. That's his view. All religious exemptions for vaccines should be eliminated. We shouldn't do it on that basis. He says religious leaders will need to join with secular institutions in opposing exemptions. Pastors are already inundated with requests for letters supporting exemptions. And as a former pastor of an evangelical church, I know it will be difficult to say no, but my colleagues should do the right thing and refuse such a request. Why? Because he says that we should refuse to mislead our secular neighbors, refuse to abuse our precious religious liberties, refuse to be complicit in putting our neighbors at risk. That's why. So here we have somebody who is a Christian. Again, I say supposedly. I don't know him. But we should refuse to abuse our precious religious liberty. Let me ask you, at what point are we supposed to stand up for our religious liberty? And for what? If not for a vaccine mandate, then for what? Because do we think that it's just going to stop here with this? That it's just going to stop with requiring you to get a vaccine? If they can mandate this, if they can mandate something that's so personal, something that has historically been a decision that happens between a medical professional, a doctor, and an individual, to make that decision based upon understanding what their medical history is, what their medical conditions are, something that personal can be told that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what your health is. It doesn't matter what you view. We're going to require you to get a mandate. Yeah. We're going to make you get a vaccine. So when do we stand up for our religious liberty? If not for that, if not now, because it'll extend beyond just a vaccine. If they can mandate this, they can mandate anything. If they get away with being able to tell you that you have to get a vaccination, which is a medical procedure, they're saying that you are being required to do a medical procedure. Where does it stop at that point? Where does it end? They will not end there. And so putting a stop to it now. And what's fascinating to me is that a Christian would be able to say this in good conscience, to be able to say that we should not allow for any sort of religious exemptions. And this is unfortunately becoming a mainstream idea within evangelical Christianity. This is an attempt to adopt this across all of Christendom, at least here within the U.S. Oh, and another one, it's not just this individual. It was, I had the article here. Yesterday, or maybe it was a couple of days ago, there was an article that came out talking about the bishops in Canada, bishops for the Catholic Church, were also talking about requiring a vaccination. And of course, now I can't find the article. But the point is that there are several churches, and you're going to see most likely denominations who are going to come out and believe and push for no religious exemptions, and in fact require people to be fully vaccinated to come to church. Here it is. So the Canadian Archbishop says that only fully vaccinated can attend Mass. Anyone aged 12 or over, according to the article, attending a gathering at Catholic churches, rectories, or community centers under the responsibility of the Archdiocese of Moncton must present proof that they are fully vaccinated, the Archdiocese announced on Friday. This new policy applies to all religious celebrations, Sunday and weekend masses, baptism, weddings and funerals, parishes and pastoral meetings, catechisms, and social meetings. So pretty much anything. And anything that you have in your life, because that includes everything. So anything that has to do with the church, you'll be required to have a vaccine and to be able to show proof of that vaccine. If you think it's just there, there's another article that came out that some of you might have seen already. And this one from 9 Marks, written by Jonathan Lehman, asking the question, must churches follow mask mandates? So this isn't particularly vaccines, but I would say that it's similar, and a lot of these are similar ideas and similar arguments that are being made. Now, there are some good things in the article, and I think some things that are helpful to think about. But the question that he tries to raise in the article, is what the authority and the role of government is, and how there's essentially this overlap between the what he calls the church's obligation and right to gather, and the government's obligation to protect life. And somehow that overlap there, right there, is where we are in the pandemic. Meaning that, well, governments have this obligation to protect life, to create policies and enforce those things that protect life, but then you also have the church that is required to come together and to gather. Which, if we draw that to the next item beyond masks, and we talk about vaccine mandates, what if you have a church member who says, I don't want to get a vaccine? But that person is required to, according to Scripture, to gather together with the body of believers. And what if churches are forced into having mandates in order to gather, which at this point is a very real possibility. We're not talking about just hypotheticals here. This is actually coming. We're already seeing it. We're already seeing evangelical leaders push for it. And they'll continue to push more. So how in the world are we going to think about that? And he offers one perspective on that. And I think overall, it's a worthwhile perspective. It says the government's obligation to protect life. What I think is missing from this article and from the conversation is several things. One, what about the science? We're always talking about the science, the science, the science. Oh, just follow the science. We need to make sure that we follow the science. But that's not taken into consideration here at all. This argument that he lays out here essentially assumes that the government is an honest broker who has evaluated everything and is providing decisions or making decisions on the basis of actual data that is scientifically tested and formed, and making those decisions about masks, making decisions about vaccines on the basis of that data and that research. Well, there is research out there, and there's research out there that supports opposite of what the government is talking about right now. But that information isn't getting out and not being discussed, partly because it's not allowed to be discussed in what is now the public domain, that is social media. And so the argument here that's being made, that government's obligation to protect life, yes, that's true, and that's biblical. We see that the government was formed for that reason. Looking at Romans 13, looking at 1 Peter 2, that's all in Scripture. It's by design. But traditionally, the things that the government has done to protect life has to do with things that we can see and understand very clearly. Things like murder. Most countries have a law against murdering one another, which is protecting life. And the government will come in with consequences if somebody violates that by taking another person's life. Or will protect people whose lives are in danger. But there's a clear thing that we can see. We can see that if somebody causes harm or is trying to do harm to somebody, the result being death, we can see scientifically what happens. So this just assumes that everything the government is saying about this virus is absolutely true, and it expects that you're going to take it exactly at face value, that what the government says is absolutely right, and they have a right to protect you, and so therefore they can put any of these mandates in place. So that's the first problem that I have with the article. The second thing that I have with the second problem I have with the article is that I think he forgets that the tendencies of government is towards tyranny. Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, in quoting, and now I can't remember his name, Daniel, and I can't remember his last name, but she had quoted him in a letter to John Adams while he was attending the Continental Congress to remind him that all men would be tyrants if able. And so governments have a tendency towards tyranny, and that's missing from this. And it's something that we need to guard against and to be watchful for. And not only that, but let's consider for a minute of which this article doesn't, the form of government that we live under within the United States of America. This is not a monarchy, which this form of government has never existed in the history of the world up until the United States was formed. Now, other countries since then have formed their countries and their governments around this. This form of a democracy or a constitutional republic, of which the United States is. But until that time, most of the world lived under a monarchy. They lived under one-person rule. And that is the context under which Paul is writing. Now, it's not that what Paul is writing is wrong and doesn't apply at all in this form of government. But this idea that we should just throw out Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 and say, well, anything the government says we must submit to, because here this is what the text says, misunderstands the type of government that the United States is formed as, which is a form of self-government. A republic is self-government. We appoint people to serve in our government through elections and through votes, and there are rights to address grievances, and there is a system that's in place by which the people, by which are not subjects, they are citizens, can address our government and push back on our government. There are checks and balances, part of which is not just having three branches of government with divided power, but the very fact that the people have a voice and they have the ability to stand up to the government when they are stepping out of line and overstepping the boundaries. And so none of those things are addressed in this article, and none of those things are taken into consideration. But all of them are important for us to recognize. And you know, Christians should recognize this more than anybody else. If we really truly believe that God created the world perfect, and that in a very short amount of time, Adam and Eve sinned, and the entire world was impacted by sin, and just a couple of chapters into Genesis after the fall, we have the entire world doing evil all the time. That's all they ever thought about. That's all they ever did was evil constantly all the time, enough that God had to send a flood, a global worldwide flood, to wipe out the entire world. We, of all people, should understand how sinful mankind can be. And we should always be watching for it and always be constantly ready to point out evil when we see evil and tyranny when we see tyranny. We, of all people, should know this. And those are the things that I think that we need to be considering very carefully. And we should be watching what's going on. You know, as we progress down this vaccine mandate more and more, and it gets pushed more and more, then you're going to start to see people come out with ways that we can actually track this. And we can track how who has not gotten a vaccination. And I came across this particular article while I was sifting around the United Nations webpage. This one's actually not, so this is not related specifically to vaccines and to COVID at all, but it was written a couple of weeks ago, actually I guess a month and a half ago, about digital technology being used to reach more children with immunizations around the world. And this is primarily the focus is other countries, not the United States. But what I found was interesting was this article starts off by saying using real-time monitoring of childhood immunization campaigns can enable real-time decision-making and ensure that children in hard-to-reach areas can be located and vaccinated in a timely manner. The report, which came from the UNICEF, which is the United Nations Children's Fund, talks about real-time monitoring. In this instance, is defined as employing digital technologies to accelerate the sharing, analysis, the use of data to improve campaign quality. It can assist teams in low and middle income countries by monitoring their progress, tracking supplies, seeing where they can be pockets of children being missed in hard-to-reach areas. Teams in various countries use a variety of software and hardware, from Android phones to WhatsApps to GPS to district health information software dashboards. Digital technology isn't just helpful for tracking actual vaccines. It can be used, the researchers say, to understand why some people are rejecting vaccines for their children and allow implementers to adjust their messaging to deal with hesitancy among those reluctant to agree to immunizations. Quote, monitoring public opinion in real time allows authorities to learn about opinions, misconceptions, and fears before they become widespread and respond to them before they escalate. Now, again, not particularly focused on this current COVID and the COVID vaccine, but don't think for a minute that this isn't what's going to be used in order to try to track and push for immunizations. You can just imagine somebody showing up at the door, knocking on it, and asking you, and recording that in a database, and recording even why you say that you don't want to if you choose not to get vaccinated. There's a lot of capability that we have in technology now in data analysis and data visualization. A lot of artificial intelligence, machine learning that's being applied to these types of things, and all they need is data. All they need to do is be able to collect as much data as they can and then run analysis and be able to very easily pinpoint who and who is not. And don't think for a minute that big tech and social media will not help them do it, because if you don't think that they will, then you probably haven't been paying attention. So all of this is going to come, and we got to be able to think about this clearly. And I think we need to be able to have as much information as we can to be able to be informed and to be educated, and to be educated about the dangers and the concerns related to these kinds of mandates, and try to reason with people. It doesn't help us to just fly off the handle and start screaming at people. We do need to try to reason with people, to use logic, to use common sense, as much as it is not really that common these days, to be able to help people to understand why this is dangerous and why this is a dangerous precedent that is being set as a result of that. And I don't understand why more Christians are not involved and more Christians are not taking this perspective. And I think a lot of it has to do with fear. A lot of people are afraid, and if you watch the news long enough, which any news station, I don't care which one it is, that will only help to build fear. And we are not to be people who just run around afraid all the time of everything. The biggest thing that we have fear of that most people have fear of, at least, is death, which is most likely why this is creating so much concern for people, because we're putting out there that there's all these people dying. And I'm not saying that COVID is not a dangerous virus, illness, that people have not died from it. People have died from it. People have gotten very sick from it. And so we shouldn't downplay that there is a seriousness about this. But what we're seeing is a very robust survival rate. But even if there wasn't, even if there was a lot more to it, then we shouldn't be living, even then, in a constant state of fear all the time. Because if the worst thing is death, it may seem like the worst thing now, but for those of us who are believers, it can only be the best thing for us, which is exactly why Paul said, absent from the body, present with the Lord. And Paul even went as far as to say that it is better that I depart. It's better for me personally that I actually depart and not be here. But for your sake, I'm actually still here and I'm still ministering to you. Which means that Paul understood that we really don't have to be afraid of death, which is the thing that most people are most afraid of. So we aren't called to be people who are constantly living in fear. You know, Scripture says that the truth shall set us free, and a lot of times we just throw that phrase around there. The truth will set us free. The truth will set us free, and it is true that it does. But the truth setting us free, it's truth about what? In this case, it's the truth that if we're in Christ, that our death means going to be with the Lord. And that can be very freeing in knowing that you no longer have to be afraid of death or really of anything. And that's what we're called to be. And in fact, we're hoping to talk a little bit about this at the G3 conference. The whole theme of the G3 conference is that Christ reigns. And if Christ really does reign, and we really do believe that, then we really don't have anything to be afraid of. Even a virus. So, we're going to leave you with that. And hopefully we'll see you at the G3 conference. Hopefully we'll be on here again before we get to the G3 conference. But nonetheless, make sure you tune in next time for the Right Stuff Matters podcast, and we'll see you next time.